Welcome to the Innovation Ecosystem Podcast. We interview remarkable and thought-provoking guests about innovation, leadership, and change in the world of business. Whether you're an executive or an entrepreneur, our objective is to help you and your organisation create an entrepreneurial culture, become more innovative, and better able to respond to change. Each week, we'll deconstruct world-class performance from the arenas of business, academia, science, and sports. Each week, you can expect key insights, fresh perspectives, and proven tools you can use straight away to make you more successful professionally and personally. With your hosts, Mark Bidwell and Roddy Miller.
Hello, I'm Roddy Miller, your co-host on the Innovation Ecosystem podcasts. In our show this week, I'm talking with Stephen D'Souza. Stephen is a much sought-after speaker and consultant on the areas of leadership, organizational development, diversity, networking, and social capital. He is trained in Gestalt psychology for groups and individuals and works frequently with senior teams, including those at CEO level. Some of his clients have included firms such as Bank of America, Eurostar, the Financial Times, Goldman Sachs, and PwC. Stephen's the author of several books. His first, Made in Britain, focused on diversity in the workplace, and his second, Brilliant Networking, as you might imagine, examined the power and practice of networking. But it is his latest book, co-written with Diana Renner, entitled Not Knowing, that I really explore with him today. In this show, Stephen very eloquently describes the role of knowledge in today's business world, and the impossibility for any of us to ever fully have all the data we need in this fast-changing environment. He powerfully explains how it is important to embrace this lack of knowing and be comfortable with it, and the important part that having decent doubt has in sustaining effective business relationships. I love Stephen's story on the CEO who knew he did not know where his strategy was leading, but was unable to share that with his colleagues for fear of losing credibility or even his job. And I really enjoy his metaphors on Cape Finisterre being historically the edge of knowledge and the fear that goes with that. And the rather more reflective and calming quote of Shun Ryu Suzuki on the beginner's mind versus the expert's mind and the acceptance of possibility and all that brings with it. The irony is perhaps that Stephen clearly has an enormous hinterland of knowledge that he draws on to promote the concept of not knowing. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Roddy. It's great to join you on this podcast.
As I was just explaining, you've recently published a book with Diana Renner called Not Knowing. I mean, it's very much positioned, I think, for our VUCA world, the volatile, uncertain, complex, and above all, ambiguous worlds that we now all live and work in. But I was interested, sort of embracing uncertainty, which obviously not knowing is something that humans don't like to do at all. And yet we're also trying very much to try and create more human organizations. So whilst not knowing is something that we don't want to do, it's also something that goes against our human nature. There's a tension there. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so we're hardwired to know. And neuroscience even points to a part of the brain called the interpreter, where when there is no meaning, it seeks automatically patterns for recognition. And the research done by David Rock, for example, has shown that uncertainty has a physical impact as much as an emotional impact of feeling threatened and of feeling in danger. So we are afraid of the unknown. But the main premise of our work and the research is that the unknown is not the same as uncertainty. So, for example, if you have children and they are waiting at Christmas or they're waiting at a birthday to see what's inside their present and that's wrapped up, they don't feel uncertainty, but they might feel curiosity, they might feel excitement, they might feel possibility. So the concept of the book is that there's many different ways to relate to the unknown rather than the feeling of uncertainty. And if we can grasp the benefits of engaging with the unknown rather than what we already know, which doesn't seem to be able to solve the complex challenges we face, then there's the opportunity to create something new. So the basic premise is, yes, we are afraid of the unknown. Our default reaction, or we can talk more about this, but tends to be the feeling of uncertainty. But if we are able to look at the unknown in a different way, to reframe our our ability to be with the unknown, that's really looking at it as a place of opportunity for something new to emerge in the business world and in the context of living in the VUCA environment that you described.
The part about the VUCA environment is presumably really the uncertainty, isn't it? And this goes back also to basics of neuroscience around emotions, which is what paralyzes us from that perspective is the fear of uncertainty, and that is the fear of not knowing, and that's how things are going to evolve and emerge. There's hopefully not much fear in opening up your Christmas presents in the morning, but in a business sense, it's that concern we always have that things are not going to go according to plan. Is that a different kind of not knowing then too?
Yes, it's not knowing information. So, for example, taking the analogy of VUCA still, many of your listeners will be familiar or might have heard of the Snowden model or the conf framework. So it distinguishes between different types of problems. So, for example, on one hand, there might be simple problems. How do I turn this and make this work? They might be more complicated problems. But the challenges that we're facing today aren't simply simple or complicated. They're complex or chaotic. And so one of the main premises is that it's impossible for leaders in organizations and managers to have all the answers in complex situations where we are in that environment of VUCA and interconnection made even more faster by technology. And as we know, the abundance and maybe the overload of information. So in that context, when it's impossible to know, not knowing isn't not knowing information, it's being able to operate in complex and even perhaps chaotic situations where it's impossible to know. So I'll give you a specific example. Take unconscious bias. We spend a lot in organizations now in recruitment and looking at the impacts of unconscious bias. But such a simple thing like this, Daniel Kahneman in his book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, points to over 150 unconscious biases from primacy, recency, confirmation bias. He says, if you think you have reasons for your beliefs, you're probably wrong. It gives us a sense of humility, as Shine calls it, humble inquiry, to recognize the limits of our knowledge. And in terms of even dealing with the business problems we face. And actually, what we start with in the book is actually the dangers of knowledge, the dangers of thinking that we know and that thinking that we understand. So going back to a simple example of the financial crisis in the global financial crisis, the Queen visited the London School of Economics in November 2008. And she asked them, if you're all so clever people, how come nobody predicted the crisis? The British Academy decided to answer her legitimate question. And they convened a panel of experts, academics, regulators, business leaders. And in the following summer, in July, a letter was released which they wrote in response to the Queen. And it said essentially that many people did predict the crisis was coming. In fact, one bank had 4,000 risk managers. The problem wasn't a lack of not knowing. The problem was overconfidence in the belief of a few that experts understood what they were talking about. So it points to hubris. It points to overconfidence in our own knowledge. And I think one of the situations that we're all facing in the world of business, and the volume things change and the interconnectivity and interdependencies that we're all operating under, is that we all face the unknown and that we all have limits in what we can know. And the time of the heroic leader, to use a metaphor, or the cult leader of Chris Bones at Henley, is over. And so we need a different approach to leadership, and that recognizes the limits of expertise, the limits of knowledge, as well as its value, but to balance our knowing with our not knowing and creating space for something new to emerge.
That's great. I mean, I love that. That's a very sort of holistic understanding of culture in organizations. But how do you suggest that organizations change that culture? Because that sounds like a collective need to embrace not knowing, but that has to presumably come from individuals too. And we know that in order to change organizational culture, there needs to be some direction from the top, possibly even some sort of heroic direction from the top.
Yes, I think you're right, in the sense that our research shows that leaders need to role model their behaviours and role modelling the idea that they're not so certain and they don't have all the answers, which is very humbling and is very confrontational and confronting for some. So I was with a CEO the night before. He was speaking to his global management team of a beer company in Belgium. And he said to me, Stephen, I do not know where we're going in 5 years' time. I cannot tell my team with conviction and any degree of certainty. But it's one thing that I can't say to them. I can't say to them, I don't know. I'll lose all credibility. I'll be deauthorized. I might even lose my job. So there's this culture that we're in, that we look to our leaders or those in management to provide direction, order, clarity. And they're in an impossible situation. So part of it is loosening the expectations we have on leaders to provide the answers. And that does differ by culture. So in some cultures, and we look across the spread, it's less expected that your manager has all the answers. So for example, Finland. But in some cultures, we expect our managers or those in authority to have all the answers, such as Spain, for example. So the ability to loosen them and give more range to our leaders is important. And it has to start with them and role modeling that behavior. So give you an example, Charles Handy tells a beautiful story at London Business School where they were deciding which professor to promote. And there was one person called Brown, and people were not sure about him and they weren't sure whether to promote him, but nobody could name why they were so unsure. And then someone raised their hand, I know why we shouldn't promote Brown. He doesn't have any decent doubt. So sure about what he wanted to do. There was no room for space for an oppositional thinking or looking at something in a different way. So I think this is a quality that leaders need to demonstrate, this decent doubt and this ability to role model and say, I don't know, in safe situations. So it's not saying it to the shareholders, but it's giving more space for multiple possibilities and multiple hypotheses rather than one individual way. Another example, specifically in a bank, global bank, there was a CLO, and she was rated 100% competent by her people. And when she read the rest of the feedback, it said nobody wanted to work for her. She was so upset and angry. She said, how can you rate me 100% competent and you don't want to work with me? And the response was, because we don't feel we can contribute anything. We always have all the answers. You're very bright. You know which direction to take us, but there's no room for us. So part of leadership is making space for others to contribute their ideas, making space for oppositional thinking to your own, and creating that space of decent doubt that Handy points to, that can allow those within the organisation to come up with something new.
I think the really fascinating part about that is that it seems though that there are two really quite distinctly separate modes there for leaders. One is when they're working with their close team, and you've got to give them space to add diversity to the conversation and add input and not know all the answers, which you clearly can't do as a leader in any case. But when you're presenting that outside external image, we know that marketing doesn't work if you're sort of putting forward an uncertain projection. And if you look at politicians who stand up and say, I don't know the answer, they're just not going to be followed. So on one side, you need to project absolute certainty, but when you're dealing perhaps more closely with people, then you can allow that interplay to occur. And that obviously is a really difficult balance to achieve.
Yes, it's having I think you're right. It's in consensus. It's showing the uncertainty and the ability to people to contribute to you. And then in actual display of leadership, because you've done that, it's a willingness to go forward with what you have with some form of confidence rather than arrogance, but also a willingness to challenge your own opinion and to change direction as appropriate. And that is difficult. We're in a culture where we call people who change direction wishy-washy, or they're not with firm convictions. Yet I would question any leader that doesn't change direction based on changing data, and whether we are living in a world that has to be more tolerant, that we live in with dilemmas, we live with contradiction, and things aren't as simple or clear-cut as we would like to believe. So I think one of the challenges of leadership is making more space for that ability to change opinion, ability on data, on valid data, ability to have humility to challenge our own perspectives, but also the confidence to go forward. So I'm not suggesting we stay in the space of I don't know. I'm suggesting that it's a space to be in and from which something new can emerge, and then to go forward from that space with conviction. But it's not certainty, and it's not the arrogance that maybe, or hubris that got us.
Absolutely. I mean, you work with lots of senior executives and CEOs from a wide array of organizations and cultures too. I mean, it's interesting what you mentioned just earlier, that Finland has a greater capacity to embrace this sort of level of uncertainty in their senior leaders versus the one you suggested was Spain. But I think there are a great deal of number of cultures. A lot of that comes presumably from the hierarchy of the organization itself. And the flatter the structure, the greater the ability, presumably, to allow that not knowingness to exist. So if that is the case, and I'd be interested to hear what you would say about that, then the issue or what needs to change is a much bigger organizational shift than individuals just embracing not knowing.
Yes. One example to make it come alive is that if you're familiar, or listeners are familiar with the Camino de Santiago, an ancient pilgrimage from France to Santiago in Spain, people would journey another 3 days to this coastal town. And in Latin, Finisterre means the end of the earth. And literally they thought that's where the earth ended. And they would look, people sailing off to the sea, they would think would fall off the edge of the world. And they would draw dragons and lions in the water to show how terrifying it is. So when an organization is facing the unknown, it can be a terrifying place. And there are certain reactions that individuals, but also organizations do when they come to that terrifying place. And we like to call it reactions at the edge. So, for example, one of the reactions might be a rush to action. Let's do something, anything. So that might manifest in the organization hiring consultants. It might be, let's just take some 90-day action plan, but it's not sitting with the sense of the world changing or with the unknown. Another might be control. So they might assert more control, taking back roles, taking back authority, centralizing. Another reaction might be paralysis by analysis. Let's call a meeting or hire a consulting company to tell us what we need to do. We need to fold or not invest in the top line and just reduce costs on the bottom line. Or there might be catastrophic thinking, we'll all be fired or this industry is dead. So we all have reactions at the edge of our knowing, which is individual, but can also be displayed by the culture of an organization. And it's recognizing what our automatic default reactions are at the edge that gives us an opportunity to try to do something new. So if I'm always rushing to control, I might look at that as a clue. Maybe I'm facing my own uncertainty here, and I can let go of some of the control and see what's available when I'm not holding on so tightly and I'm not trying to control so tightly. So, and that applies for an individual, but also applies to an organizational culture.
I mean, from your research, do you see that it's more difficult to do that in different types of organizations, either based on size or sector? And can you observe different cultural approaches to being able to accept uncertainty or not knowing?
Yeah, paradoxically, I've noticed a greater acceptance of uncertainty in the financial sector, who I tend to work mostly with. Possibly this is in reaction to the great changes happening within that industry in terms of possible breakup or disintermediation by new startups, but also the recognition that the world isn't going back to what it used to be. and that they're, as large institutions, they're going to have to do work in a different way. So part of it, I'm noticing a tendency within traditional large institutions. So I think there's a big myth that smaller, flatter companies tend to be more facing the not knowing. I think more smaller, sometimes they tend to be more assertiveness, more control, and paradoxically more freedom within larger organizations than the small startup. It's like the dilemma between the open office and the cubicle, which is better. So David Burkus, in his new book, Under New Management, draws on the tension of that. So sometimes open spaces can inhibit our freedom to speak freely and lower that. So I wouldn't say that not knowing is only for startups or for SMEs. I'd say it's also for larger organizations, and it's the ability, and it's particularly important for larger organizations because they're more at risk of the threat of the unknown and from other competitors, etc., in that space. So I would point to across cultures, but my experience tends to be it's particularly important in larger organizations.
Okay. And does that play through from their own perception of themselves as a commercial organization into their ability to innovate, do you think? I mean, is there a connection there, or do people tend to think innovatively about their products and their services on the one hand, and then rather differently about their organizational structure and how they work internally as something completely separate?
Yeah, I think innovation happens at all levels, of course, but often happens at the individual level and at the unit level, the business team level. But to give you an example of how the new thinking can happen industry-wide or by changing something. So staying with the banking, looking at such a simple like microfinance, the founder of microfinance, Mohammed Yunus, he was speaking about how he developed the concept. But he talks about not knowing something can be a blessing sometimes. You're open and you can do things your way without worrying about rules and procedures. He said, I could try because I didn't know anything. And that research is backed up by Christian Bush from the London School of Economics at the Innovation Lab. He said that microcredit, mobile banking, micro-saving, all innovations that came out of context where there was no real infrastructure in place or pre-existing concept of how things can be done. So I think in an organization where it's always been done this way, it's much harder to generate the innovative and the beginner's mind. But it is possible, and I think it demands a leader who's open to conflicting opinions to their own, and a willingness to hear original rather than to crush differentiating opinions. So it points to a range of factors there.
Well, I was just about to pick up, because I love that quote from your book from, is it Shunryu Suzuki, on emptying your cup, and that difference between the beginner's mind and the expert's mind, and which one has the greater sort of capacity to accept possibility. It's an intuitive for everyone to understand that the less you know of something, the more you're prepared to accept.
What happens is there's a psychological effect. It's called the Dunning-Kruger effect, and the two psychologists from Cornell won the Nobel Prize for Psychology for this effect. But it talks about when you're a beginner or you have no knowledge, you tend to be overconfident. You tend to overestimate your ability. But as you become an expert, it tends to go down. And then you return, when you're a real expert, you tend to have a more modest and a more humble understanding of your issue. So I don't, although I talk about it, I'm not saying that it's not like Tetlock. I'm not saying there's a expertise is negative. If I want heart surgery, I go to a heart surgeon, then go to a generalist. But the value of real experts is that people who are deep in their domain recognize the limits of their knowledge, and they're not falling to overconfidence. So part of it is, yes, recognize the beginner's mind, recognize that I love the quote, in the beginner's mind are many possibilities, in the expert's mind there are few. But the idea here is how can we develop expertise, but develop the openness to be willing to entertain, to dialogue with alternative opinions. And that's very difficult. I like Linda Grattan in her book, The Shift, which she wrote really for her young children to prepare them for the world of work in the future. She talks about the concept of becoming a serial expert. So not just diving in gently, but mastering a subject so you have some grounding and some depth, and then moving on to master another subject and look for the interrelational aspects between the two, and so forth. And I think this is one of the new ways of working too, in which we won't have people with one job for life or 5 jobs for life. It might be 20 different types of roles for the up and coming generations. So that ability to be neo-generalists, which I've heard is a term by a new book coming out, that ability to recognize the value of expertise, but to be able to have the agility to be open and to keep on learning. I think that's one of the key messages there.
And I think that opens up this whole idea of experimentation and playfulness in what you're doing too. I think the part of the problem of being an expert is that you see too many barriers. Are there things that you suggest or recommend that allow people who are immersed in their subject to perhaps adopt again a bit of a beginner's mind?
Yeah, I'd say part of it is we talk about the value of working with people who are absolute beginners, because it might be in the form of mentoring, it might be in the form of teaching, but when you're working with them and you're describing what you know to somebody who is without any foundational knowledge, it demands from us an ability to translate our thoughts and also to reevaluate our thinking. So one of the exercises in the book is, speak to somebody who doesn't have any knowledge of of your field and see if you can describe it simply. I think it's Warren Buffett who describes how he describes his investment to his wife and says that's the test. Or Mark Twain, who says, "I'm sorry, I didn't have enough time to write a shorter letter."
Indeed.
There's the ability to reevaluate our thinking and communicate it clearly, I think, is there. And also in terms of an organization and the experimenting you talk about, part of it is how do you make room for that, not as setting up an incubator, but in everyday working life. How do you make more space in team meetings for multiple hypotheses, for example, around what's going on? Maybe staying with questions a bit longer rather than moving straight to solutions. So there are small things that we can do in daily organizational life, I think, make more space for the more interpretive and the more experimental and the more playful, rather than this is the way, this is what we can do, much more linear, which might not be the best solution in terms of tackling a complex challenge.
And that takes us back to that original point of around curiosity. We know that some people are just naturally more curious than others. Are there ways to make people in your team have a sense of greater curiosity, to be intrigued by the not knowingness of things? Or does one just have to accept that there are going to be team members who are looking for certainty and want direction?
Yeah, I think we can encourage and we can nurture the practice of curiosity rather than thinking it's something that we either have or innately or we don't. So, for example, one of the exercises I do with executives is I ask them to get a piece of paper and write down everything they know about a complex challenge they're facing at work, and give them a minute or so and they fill that paper. We ask them to fold it in half again, and then put it into their pocket so they can keep what they know. We're not asking them to remove what they know. There's value there. And then we give them a second piece of paper and say, on this same time, I want you to write down all the questions you have around your problem, all the curiosities you have, all the things that you don't know. And they write that. And then I ask them metaphorically to hold the 2 pieces of paper in their different hands, which seems to be the lighter, which the heavier, which was the longer list, which was the shorter list. And it's quite a fascinating exercise because it does show that people have curiosity, that there's a much more space for questions and for what they don't know around a challenge. But we need to create the context in which they're able to hold that. And the leader's able to opinions, that might have doubts, might have different points of view, and that space for not knowing. It's a very powerful tool to do that. So that's a simple example, but it's possible to put a structure for curiosity and for our questioning and for the space of balancing the knowing with the not knowing.
Yeah, it's giving people permission to not know in a large extent.
Yes.
Fascinating. There are a couple of things I just quickly wanted to touch on. I'm conscious that our time is flying past, but I know your previous book, Brilliant Networking, that you wrote some time ago, also covers an area that in modern work we need to understand a bit better. What are the connections between not knowing and brilliant networking?
I think one of the connections is in reaching out to others and going past that model of one person has all the answers. So the value of, so for example, in networking, I don't talk about business cards or elevator pictures, but I talk about the structure, the quality, the diversity of your network. So one of the direct parallels is building diversity in your network, building differences in your network enables you to have more data in terms of addressing situations of not knowing, benefiting from different perspectives. A simple business example is their company IDEO, very small team, but they have built specifically differences into that team. So they might have a linguist, they might have a psychologist, they might have a medical doctor, but they all contribute in the diverse network to giving and to generating new ideas that might not have been possible with one person only operating in their field. So I think networks and networking enables us to deal with the VUCA world, and it gives us the ability to recognize our limits, but also to benefit from the knowing of others. Superb.
Thank you very much. Now, a question we always like to ask of our guests is, given this, the knowledge and insights you've gained from your research and work with high-level executives over the years, looking back, what advice would you give yourself, your 25-year-old self, or your younger self now that you think would have been useful for you to have had then?
I once interviewed a comedian called Angela Marr. She was one of the first British African comedians on the television with her radio program. And she said to me something I think was very important for young people. Said, when you're 14, your child, if you don't choose the right options in your GCSE, then your career will be over. 16, don't choose the right A-levels, then it's over. 18, get the right degree, then it's over. We put too much pressure on ourselves to follow the path and to be able to know what the right direction is here. And she said to me, Stephen, you don't need to do anything before you're 30. It's about playing, it's about experimenting, it's about trying new things. And I think this is one of the challenges what advice I'd give to myself. Time to experiment more, time to try different new things. So one of the quotes that we end the introduction to the book is by the Spanish poet Antonio Machado. He says, "Traveler, there is no path. The path is made by walking." So the advice would be, to walk the different routes, to find your own path and this is the same for organizational life and not just your personal life.
Oh, what a lovely idea, concept. That really chimes with me. In fact, it's oddly, it's something similar that my father told me. That was, of course, after I'd chosen my path. So he hadn't told me at the age of 14 or 15. But, I think you've got to be quite brave as a parent to tell your children that at that stage. But I completely understand and agree with the sentiment. Stephen, I've really enjoyed our conversation. Despite the focus on not knowing, I think you've brought a great deal of knowledge to us in this conversation. And I hope that the listeners, like myself, have found it stimulating and useful. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Roddy.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Stephen D'Souza. After we finished recording, I mentioned to Stephen that my 9-year-old son had announced to me on the ski slope recently that he knew everything about skiing. And when I suggested to him that might not be the case, he couldn't quite believe it. Stephen, however, noted that this kind of example of the beginner's mind was in fact really valuable, and that without it, we do not have the confidence to push boundaries. It's an important insight, though not one I may share with my son quite yet, perhaps. More seriously, I truly believe, based upon many conversations with senior leaders, that the ability to embrace the unknown is a fundamental competence. I hope you enjoyed Stephen's story on the CEO who knew he did not know where his strategy was leading, but was unable to share that with his colleagues for fear of losing credibility or even his job. And Stephen's sage advice that we have to loosen our expectations that we have on leaders to provide all the answers. Once more, we see that what is often at the root of so many issues in organisation is our fear, our inability to treat people in organisations as adults, accepting that, of course, even our leaders do not have all the answers, and that we'd have a much more sustainable environment if we acted in an adult fashion that accepted this and recognised the risks associated with it, and gave everyone permission to strive and occasionally fail. Making decisions and then adapting them as we see what effect they have, rather than having to stick rigidly to very structured frameworks, is a much more sustainable way of running an organisation. I do recommend that you take a moment to go to the website www.innovationecosystem.com and make use of our show notes. You can download the transcript there and also see links to Stephen's books and other things he mentions. Next week, Mark talks to Whitney Johnson, the co-founder with Harvard professor Clayton Christensen of Rose Park Advisors. Johnson expands on Christensen's critical work on disruptive innovation for companies with her personal take on disrupting yourself. Definitely one to listen in for. If you enjoy these shows, we'd really appreciate if you can take a couple of moments to rate and review them on iTunes. These shows do take a good bit of time and energy to put together, and we love to get your feedback that way. Many thanks to all our listeners who have left reviews. We really appreciate them. Keep them coming. And do contact us if you have any questions for our guests or other comments. I look forward to being with you again shortly.